Imagine a rifle coming back from the front lines, but it's not the same weapon that left the factory. The barrel is 6 inches shorter, the crown is filed down by hand, and the serial number is barely visible under a layer of battlefield grime. This wasn't a rare sight in 1944. In fact, Canadian armorers stationed from the battered Gothic line in Italy to the flooded fields of the Netherlands were seeing it every week. The pile of altered Lee Enfields and battered Sten guns grew larger, each one a silent witness to a war fought on very different terms than the rulebooks ever imagined. Officially, none of this was supposed to happen. Military regulations were crystal clear. No soldier was allowed to modify government-issued weapons or gear. The rules were strict, the penalties severe. Anyone caught hacking apart a rifle or carving up a helmet faced formal charges, lost pay, and the real threat of a court-martial. The Canadian Army, like its American allies, believed that discipline and standardization were the backbone of victory. Every piece of equipment was designed, tested, and approved by experts far from the front lines. The message from Ottawa was simple: follow the manual or face the consequences. But the reality on the ground was a different story. The first time a soldier tried to clear a doorway in a ruined Italian village with a full-length rifle, or spent a freezing night in a foxhole with a helmet that offered no warmth, the rules started to blur. Orders written in distant training camps didn't always survive first contact with the enemy. In the chaos of house-to-house fighting, or the mud and misery of the European winter, survival meant making hard choices. Soldiers began to quietly reshape their weapons and gear, not out of rebellion but out of necessity. Sergeants developed a kind of selective blindness, turning away when they saw a rifle that looked a little too short or a helmet stuffed with extra padding. Officers, focused on the next objective, often chose not to ask questions. Across every Canadian formation, and in the American units fighting alongside them, men were quietly rewriting the rules. They cut, carved, and improvised, creating weapons and equipment that the factories and ordnance boards never imagined. Some of these modifications were pure genius, the kind of battlefield innovation that would later inspire official changes in military doctrine. Others were desperate gambles that sometimes ended in disaster, but every single one of them was technically illegal, a direct violation of King's regulations and the Army Act. The risk was real, but so was the need. In the end, the unofficial arsenal that emerged from the front lines was a testament to the soldier's instinct for survival, and a reminder that the true story of war is often written far from the pages of any manual. And as the war dragged on, the pile of modified weapons at the Canadian Ordnance Depot kept growing, each one carrying a story of risk, ingenuity, and the relentless drive to stay alive, no matter what the rulebook said. But the arsenal was just the beginning. The real secrets lay in the details of how these modifications were made and why soldiers were willing to risk everything for a fighting chance. When most Americans picture a World War II soldier, they see the iconic steel helmet, an unmistakable symbol of the greatest generation. But what most people don't realize is that, for thousands of Canadian and American troops slugging it out across Europe, that helmet was both a lifeline and a liability. Designed in distant factories and approved by military engineers who'd never spent a night in a freezing foxhole, the standard-issue helmet was supposed to protect against shrapnel and flying debris. But on the front lines, it quickly became clear that survival meant more than just stopping a piece of metal. The winter of 1943 in Italy was brutal, even by wartime standards. Temperatures plunged below freezing, icy winds whipped through shattered towns like Ortona, and the men of the Canadian and U.S. armies found themselves fighting not just the enemy, but the cold itself. The helmet's thin liner and rigid suspension system offered almost no insulation. Frostbite was a constant threat, and a helmet that fit perfectly in a training camp became a torture device in the field. Regulations strictly forbade any modification to the liner or suspension, but for soldiers shivering through endless nights, the rulebook was the last thing on their minds. So the improvisation began. Soldiers stuffed their helmets with anything they could find: strips of wool blanket, scraps of parachute silk, even pieces of cardboard torn from ration boxes. Some lucky troops got their hands on captured Italian scarves, packing them so thick inside the helmet that it barely fit on their heads. The goal was simple: keep the cold at bay long enough to see the next sunrise. Veterans of the Seaforth Highlanders later recalled helmets so jammed with makeshift padding that they looked twice as thick as regulation. It wasn't pretty, and it definitely wasn't authorized, but it was the difference between fighting and freezing. When summer arrived, the problem flipped. In the scorching heat of the Leary Valley, helmets became ovens. Sweat poured down soldiers' faces and heat exhaustion struck faster than enemy fire. Once again, the men took matters into their own hands. They cut ventilation slits into the liner fabric, loosened the suspension straps, and did whatever it took to let a little air in. Some even removed parts of the liner entirely, risking a less secure fit for a few moments of relief. The official stance was clear: any modification was strictly prohibited. But on the front lines, comfort and survival always came first. The campaign in the Netherlands brought the worst of both worlds. The winter of 1944-45 was one of the coldest in European memory, and the flooded fields along the Maas River turned every night into a test of endurance. Soldiers lined their helmets with cork from life preservers, stuffed in more cardboard, and even used silk from parachutes to create makeshift insulation. The trade-offs were real. Loosened suspension meant the helmet didn't absorb impacts as well. Improvised padding shifted during combat, sometimes leaving dangerous gaps. But for the men on the ground, the math was simple. A helmet that kept you conscious was better than one that left you numb and helpless. Officers and quartermasters tried to enforce the rules, confiscating modified helmets during inspections and threatening disciplinary action. But the reality was impossible to ignore. A man knocked out by cold was already lost to the fight. A man with a modified helmet, no matter how rough, might still have a chance. In the end, the unofficial modifications spread through every unit, passed quietly from veteran to rookie, from one desperate night to the next. These helmet hacks never made it into the official manuals, and after the war most were quietly erased from the record. But the stories survived in letters home, in interviews decades later, and in the memories of families who still keep those battered helmets as reminders of what it took to survive. For every American or Canadian soldier who made it through the winter, the real secret wasn't just the steel shell on their head, it was the ingenuity and determination hidden inside. And as the war raged on, the helmet became more than just protection from shrapnel. It became a symbol of the soldier's will to adapt, improvise, and overcome, no matter what the regulations said. But the helmet was just the beginning. The next battlefield innovation would come from the need to carry weapons faster, quieter, and more securely than any manual ever imagined. In the chaos of World War II, every second counted. For American and Canadian soldiers fighting their way through the ruins of Europe, the difference between life and death could come down to how quickly you could bring your rifle to bear. The standard-issue sling, designed in a boardroom and approved by distant military officials, was supposed to be the perfect solution. But on the front lines, it quickly became clear that the official gear wasn't up to the challenge of real combat. The regulation sling was made of stiff leather or heavy canvas, built to last but not to adapt. In the freezing mountains of Italy, the leather straps cracked and stiffened, turning rigid in the cold. In the flooded fields of the Netherlands, canvas slings soaked up water like a sponge, growing heavier with every step and never truly drying out. Metal fittings, meant to secure the rifle, clinked and rattled against the receiver, betraying a soldier's position to any enemy listening in the dark. The manual said these slings were essential, but the men on the ground knew better. So the improvisation began. Soldiers started cutting up anything they could find to make their own slings: parachute cord, strips of captured German belts, even pieces of Italian cavalry gear. Some men fashioned single-point slings that let the rifle hang ready at the chest, a design that wouldn't become standard in the US military for decades. These homemade solutions were lighter, quieter, and faster, giving soldiers the edge they needed in the split-second chaos of battle. The ingenuity didn't stop there. In the thick forests of Northwest Europe, American GIs and Canadian infantrymen alike learned to tie their rifles with whatever was at hand. Paracord, a staple of modern survival gear, made its first appearance on the battlefields of World War II, long before it became a household name in the US Army. Soldiers wove intricate knots, creating slings that could be adjusted on the fly, slung over a shoulder, or tightened across the chest for a quick draw. These field-made slings were a far cry from the regulation issue, but they worked, and in war, that was all that mattered. Of course, these modifications came with risks. Quartermasters refused to issue replacement parts for improvised slings, and officers confiscated non-regulation straps during inspections. If a homemade sling failed during a river crossing or a night patrol, the rifle could be lost forever, sinking into the mud or vanishing in the darkness. But for every weapon lost, there were countless stories of soldiers who swore their improvised sling had saved their life, allowing them to react faster, move quieter, and fight harder than any manual ever allowed. The story of the improvised sling is a story of American and Canadian innovation under fire. It's about soldiers refusing to accept the limitations of their issued gear, and instead trusting their own instincts and ingenuity. These men weren't just breaking the rules, they were rewriting them, one knot and one strap at a time. The lessons they learned on the battlefields of Europe would echo through the decades, shaping the way the U.S. military approached gear and equipment for generations to come. Today, modern tactical slings are standard issue for American troops, designed for speed, flexibility, and comfort. But the roots of these innovations can be traced back to the muddy fields and shattered towns of World War II, where soldiers with nothing but a length of cord and a desperate need to survive changed the way rifles were carried forever. The official record may not mention these improvised slings, but the veterans who came home and the families who still keep those battered rifles know the truth. And as the war raged on, the need for battlefield innovation only grew. The next challenge would come from the weapons themselves, unreliable, prone to jamming, and in desperate need of a soldier's touch. The story of the Sten gun and its infamous magazine was about to begin. If you ask any World War II veteran about the most unpredictable weapon on the battlefield, the Sten gun is almost guaranteed to make the list. For American and Canadian troops fighting side by side in Europe, the Sten was both a blessing and a curse. A lightweight submachine gun that could spit out rounds in a hurry, but just as often jammed at the worst possible moment. The real culprit, the magazine. It was the Achilles heel of the Sten, and it forced soldiers to become gunsmiths in the field, risking everything to keep their weapons firing when it mattered most. The Sten's magazine was a marvel of simplicity on paper, but a nightmare in practice. Its single-column design, meant to make manufacturing cheap and fast, was prone to bending, warping, and jamming. The feed lips, those tiny metal tabs that guide each round into the chamber, were notoriously fragile. A single drop or bump could throw the whole system out of alignment. Springs weakened without warning, and mud, sand, or even a little rain could turn a functioning Sten into a useless hunk of metal. For soldiers in the thick of combat, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a matter of life and death. Officially, the rules were clear. No one was allowed to modify the magazine. Any attempt to file, bend, or adjust the feed lips was strictly forbidden by military regulations. The logic was simple. An altered magazine could misfeed, jam, or fail to lock into the receiver, leaving a soldier defenseless in a firefight. But on the front lines, where the enemy was often just yards away, the official stance didn't hold up. Soldiers needed their weapons to work, no matter what the manual said. So the modifications began. Some troops started by carefully filing the feed lips, trying to reduce friction and make magazine changes smoother. Others replaced the factory springs with stiffer wire salvaged from other equipment, hoping that extra tension would force rounds into the chamber more reliably. In the mud and chaos of the Italian campaign, Canadian and American soldiers alike discovered that slightly bending the magazine catch could reduce the wobble that caused so many feeding failures. These tricks spread quickly, passed from one squad to another, shared in whispers and hurried demonstrations during rare moments of downtime. Innovation didn't stop there. Some soldiers began tapping two magazines together, creating a makeshift jungle mag for faster reloads, a technique that would become standard decades later in the U.S. military. Others went even further, filing down the magazine housing on the Sten itself to create a smoother insertion path. Every modification was a gamble. Filed feed lips sometimes sheared off under stress, overtensioned springs could crack after just a few reloads, and a poorly modified magazine might refuse to seat properly, turning a soldier's lifeline into dead weight at the worst possible time. But the risk was worth it. The issued magazines were already failing, and any change, no matter how risky, felt like a way to take control in a world where so much was uncontrollable. For every story of a Sten jamming at the wrong moment, there was another of a soldier whose quick fix kept him alive in a close-quarters fight. These field modifications, born out of desperation and necessity, would eventually influence official military doctrine. The U.S. Army and other allied forces would later adopt many of these forbidden tricks, recognizing that the men on the ground often knew best. Today, collectors and historians still debate the legacy of the Sten gun. Was it a symbol of wartime ingenuity, or a cautionary tale about cutting corners in weapon design? For the men who carried it, the answer was simple. You did whatever it took to keep your weapon firing. The story of the Sten's magazine is a story of American and Canadian soldiers refusing to accept defeat, turning every setback into an opportunity for innovation. And as the war pressed on, the need for adaptation only grew. The next battlefield challenge would come from the rifles themselves, long, unwieldy, and never designed for the brutal, up-close fighting that defined so much of World War II. The story of the Lee Enfield's transformation was about to unfold, revealing just how far soldiers would go to survive. For American and Canadian soldiers fighting their way through the shattered towns of Europe, the Lee Enfield rifle was both a trusted companion and a stubborn adversary. On paper, it was a masterpiece of British engineering, accurate, reliable, and deadly at long range. But in the brutal, up-close chaos of World War II's urban combat, the Lee Enfield's greatest strength became its biggest weakness. At over 44 inches long, the rifle was a giant in the cramped hallways and rubble-strewn doorways of places like Ortona and Caen. The official doctrine said the rifle was perfect as issued. The men on the ground knew better. The first time a soldier tried to clear a doorway with a full-length Lee Enfield, the problem became obvious. The rifle caught on doorframes, snagged on debris, and made it nearly impossible to react quickly in a split-second fight. The regulations from Ottawa and London were ironclad. No one was to cut, carve, or reshape the stock. The dimensions had been carefully calculated for balance, recoil absorption, and accuracy. Any modification was considered destruction of government property, a charge that could end a soldier's career and cost him dearly in pay and reputation. But the battlefield had its own rules. In the house-to-house fighting that defined the Italian campaign, Canadian and American troops began to take matters into their own hands. Using bayonets, hacksaws, and whatever tools they could scrounge, soldiers started shortening the buttstocks of their rifles by inches. The goal was simple: create a weapon that could swing around corners, clear doorways, and fire from the hip in the blink of an eye. These field-modified rifles were never pretty, but they were fast, and in close-quarters combat, speed was everything. The modifications didn't stop with the stock. The Lee Enfield's iron sights were factory set for 300 yards, perfect for open fields but useless in the bombed-out ruins where most firefights happened at 30 feet or less. Soldiers began filing down the front sight posts, lowering them to adjust for the shorter ranges they actually faced. Some removed the rear aperture entirely, preferring a clear, unobstructed view down the barrel for snap shooting. Others wrapped the front sight with white thread or medical tape, making it easier to see in the dim light of a European winter. A few even swapped out issued components for captured German parts, convinced that enemy gear offered faster target acquisition. These changes came with real risks. Shortened stocks meant the rifle's powerful .303 round kicked harder, bruising shoulders and making sustained fire painful. Carved wood splintered under stress, and there were cases where stocks failed entirely in the heat of battle. Altered sights destroyed the rifle's original zero, making long-range shots nearly impossible and sometimes sending rounds feet away from the intended target. Officers who discovered these modifications treated them as serious offenses, and soldiers caught with altered rifles faced formal charges and replacement costs docked from their pay. But for the men on the front lines, the choice was clear. A rifle that was too long to use in a fight was more dangerous than one that kicked hard or shot a little wide. In the chaos of urban warfare, the ability to react quickly, to bring a weapon to bear in a split second, could mean the difference between life and death. The official manuals never acknowledged these realities, but the soldiers who survived did so because they trusted their instincts over the rulebook. The story of the Lee Enfield's transformation is a story of American and Canadian ingenuity under fire. It's about men who refused to let regulations stand in the way of survival, who risked punishment and pay to give themselves a fighting chance. These field modifications, born out of necessity, would later influence military thinking on weapon design and close-quarters combat. Today, collectors and historians still search for these altered rifles, each one a silent testament to the men who carried them and the battles they fought. As the war dragged on, the need for adaptation only grew. The next and most dangerous modification would push the limits of what a soldier could risk and what a weapon could endure. The story of barrel shortening and improvised muzzle work was about to reveal just how far men would go when survival was on the line. In the annals of World War II weapon modifications, nothing was more daring or more dangerous than the act of barrel shortening. For American and Canadian soldiers fighting in the unforgiving streets of Europe, the decision to take a hacksaw to a government-issued rifle was the ultimate gamble. It was a move that could end a military career in an instant, but for many, it was a risk worth taking when survival was on the line. The Lee Enfield, with its long, precision-machined barrel, was designed for accuracy and power at distance. But in the close-quarters chaos of urban combat, where every doorway could hide an enemy and every corner was a potential ambush, those extra inches became a liability. Soldiers found themselves struggling to maneuver their rifles in tight spaces, losing precious seconds that could mean the difference between life and death. The official regulations from Ottawa and London were unyielding. Altering the barrel was not just forbidden, it was considered outright destruction of military property. The penalties were severe: confiscation of the weapon, formal charges, and a court-martial that could follow a soldier long after the war ended. But the front lines had their own logic. In the shattered towns of Italy and the dense forests of northwest Europe, soldiers began to quietly defy the rulebook. Armed with hacksaws, files, and whatever tools they could find, they set about shortening their rifle barrels by several inches. The goal was simple: create a weapon that could be brought to bear instantly in the split-second violence of house-to-house fighting. Some men, drawing on pre-war experience as machinists or metalworkers, attempted to recrown the barrel by hand, carefully filing the muzzle to preserve as much accuracy as possible. Others, lacking the right tools or time, made rough cuts and hoped for the best. The risks were enormous. The precisely machined crown at the end of the barrel was critical for accuracy. Once it was gone, bullets could tumble, veer off course, or even strike targets sideways, a phenomenon known as keyholing. In the worst cases, a poorly cut barrel could rupture under the pressure of a .303 round, turning the rifle into a deadly hazard for the man holding it. Armorers at the Canadian Ordnance Depot and American Supply Depots documented cases of weapons returned with catastrophic failures: barrels split open, muzzles blown apart, and rifles rendered completely useless. Yet for every disaster there were stories of success. Soldiers who managed to shorten their barrels without destroying the weapon found themselves with a rifle that was faster, lighter, and far more maneuverable in the close-quarters battles that defined so much of the war in Europe. These modified rifles could be swung around corners, fired from the hip, and brought to bear in the blink of an eye. In the chaos of street fighting in Ortona, the trench raids along the Hitler Line, and the brutal village combat around Caen, these illegal modifications often meant the difference between life and death. Officers who discovered shortened barrels treated the act as a serious offense. Weapons were confiscated on the spot, and soldiers faced charges that could lead to loss of pay, demotion, or worse. But on the front lines, enforcement was inconsistent at best. Many sergeants and junior officers understood the realities of combat and turned a blind eye, recognizing that survival sometimes meant breaking the rules. The official record rarely acknowledged these modifications, but the stories lived on in the memories of the men who made them. The legacy of barrel shortening is a testament to the ingenuity and desperation of American and Canadian soldiers under fire. It's a story of men who refused to let regulations dictate their fate, who risked everything for a fighting chance in the most dangerous environments imaginable. Today, collectors and historians still search for these rare, field-modified rifles, each one a silent witness to the courage and resourcefulness of the soldiers who carried them. As the war drew to a close, most of these weapons were collected, inspected, and destroyed, their stories nearly lost to history. But the spirit of adaptation and survival that drove these modifications would live on, shaping the way future generations of American soldiers approached the challenges of combat. The ultimate gamble of barrel shortening was more than just a technical tweak. It was a bold statement of a soldier's will to survive, no matter what the rulebook said. And as the dust settled over Europe, the question remained: what other secrets did these battlefield innovations hold, and how many stories of courage and ingenuity were quietly erased from the official record? The answers, as always, lay in the hands of the men who were willing to risk everything for a fighting chance. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe, the story of World War II didn't end, it simply changed shape. For American and Canadian soldiers, the return home meant leaving behind not just the battlefields, but also the improvised weapons and gear that had kept them alive. The official record would quietly erase most traces of these field modifications, but the legacy of ingenuity, risk, and survival would echo for generations. After the war, military authorities moved quickly to collect, inspect, and destroy the vast majority of modified rifles, helmets, and gear. The Canadian Ordnance Depot and American supply depots became graveyards for these altered weapons, each one a silent testament to the choices made under fire. Official reports labeled them as maintenance problems or equipment damage, rarely acknowledging the desperate circumstances that led to their creation. The rulebook was restored, and the story of battlefield innovation was almost lost to history. But the truth couldn't be buried so easily. In Legion halls from Vancouver to Halifax, and in American VFW posts from New York to Los Angeles, veterans swapped stories over coffee and beer. They remembered the rifle that was too long until it wasn't, the helmet that kept a man alive through a winter that should have killed him, and the Sten gun that jammed until someone figured out a fix. These stories, passed down in family conversations and preserved in handwritten letters, became a hidden history, one that official records could never fully capture. Today, the legacy of these modifications lives on in unexpected places. Family collections across the United States and Canada sometimes reveal a battered Lee Enfield with a shortened stock, a helmet lined with faded wool, or a Sten magazine that's been carefully filed and taped. These artifacts, often tucked away in attics or displayed in local museums, are more than just relics. They're living proof of the ingenuity and determination that defined a generation. For collectors and historians, finding one of these modified weapons is like uncovering a secret chapter of World War II, a direct link to the men who refused to let regulations stand in the way of survival. In recent years, there's been a surge of interest in these battlefield modifications. Online forums, YouTube channels, and social media groups dedicated to military history have become gathering places for enthusiasts eager to share discoveries and debate the finer points of wartime innovation. Rumors occasionally surface about rare, unaltered examples hidden in private collections, or about a forgotten cache of modified rifles discovered in an old barn or basement. While many of these stories remain unverified, they fuel a growing fascination with the untold side of the war, the side that never made it into the official manuals. The impact of these modifications goes far beyond the weapons themselves. They represent a mindset that has shaped American military thinking ever since, the belief that adaptability, resourcefulness, and the willingness to break the rules when necessary are just as important as discipline and training. The lessons learned by those soldiers, lessons written in sweat, blood, and the occasional hacksaw, have influenced everything from modern tactical gear to the way today's U.S. Army approaches battlefield problem-solving. For families whose grandfathers or great-grandfathers served in World War II, these stories are a powerful reminder of what it took to survive. The battered rifle in the attic, the helmet with a homemade liner, the faded photograph of a young man in uniform, all are pieces of a legacy that stretches from the foxholes of Europe to the living rooms of America. They remind us that history isn't just written in official reports or government archives. It lives on in the choices made by ordinary people under extraordinary circumstances. As we look back on the legacy of these field modifications, one question lingers. How many more stories remain untold, hidden in family collections or waiting to be discovered in the pages of a forgotten letter? The ingenuity and courage of those soldiers continue to inspire, challenging us to look beyond the official record and seek out the real stories of survival and adaptation. In the end, the legacy of World War II's battlefield modifications is more than just a footnote in military history. It's a testament to the American spirit of innovation, the willingness to take risks, and the unbreakable drive to overcome any obstacle. The weapons may have been destroyed, but the stories and the lessons live on, waiting to be rediscovered by a new generation eager to understand what it truly means to fight, adapt, and survive.